Okay, hello. Welcome to another video. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to be talking about pathological demand avoidance. This is something that I've been learning about a little bit recently. So the reason I never really looked into PDA before is probably because anytime I would come across some mention of PDA, like autism and PDA or something like that, I would think that it meant public displays of affection, and that it was some topic regarding like autism and relationships. So I would mostly just kind of scroll past that stuff. But then I realized that it stands for persistent demand avoidance, or pathological demand avoidance. And that's kind of a scary term. So most likely I would have come across something the same, pathological demand avoidance and autism, and I would have just been like, oh, that's scary, I don't want to have that, let's not learn about it, and continue to be in denial. Subconsciously, I'm pretty sure I knew. I was like, that sounds kind of like something that I would have. So I finally looked into it over the past couple months. And we're trying to get it renamed or rebranded to persistent drive for autonomy, because that is what the internal experience feels like. I mentioned this a little bit in my last video about my parents, and I mentioned that they were very, very demanding of me, and it triggered anxiety. And that's what PDA is. It's kind of an anxiety condition. It's a fight or flight response that happens when somebody feels that their autonomy or identity is being threatened. And it can come across as, especially in children, as a stubborn and bratty child, stubborn and bratty behavior. Because you could ask a child with PDA to do a chore and they would get standoffish and become defensive because of their anxiety. But from the outside, it just doesn't look like that. And even internally, I didn't really realize that it was anxiety until I researched this. I just thought, this is another thing that's wrong with me. Or in recent years, I've reasoned that I don't want to meet people's demands because they're not fulfilling to me, and because I'm not really interested in wider society and humanity as a whole anymore, due to the fact that I've been pretty much rejected by them and ostracized. So I figured, I just don't want a job anymore because I was treated so badly in jobs before and I hated it so much that, it makes sense that I don't want one anymore. But it turns out a lot of the anxiety and, meltdowns that I was facing when I was employed were probably in part due to this pathological demand avoidance thing. And it goes beyond just, requests by other people. It can also be an anxiety about just your personal daily tasks. I remember as a kid, and apparently this is fairly common for autistic people with PDA, but I remember having this thought as a kid, learning about personal hygiene, and realizing that I would have to do this every single day for the rest of my life. And it just was an exhausting idea. I was just exhausted immediately. I kind of was tired at the prospect of living my life, even as a child. And this isn't, just about laziness, right? This isn't just laziness. And it's not about I don't want to do difficult things. I don't want to do hard things, right? I do things that are difficult pretty much every single day, and I do them willingly. But there are some things that come along with this sense of imprisonment or being trapped. Whenever I was at school, whenever I was at work, I would just feel trapped, right? And so it wasn't, the demands in specific, right? It wasn't specifically the tasks that I was asked to do that were the problem. It was the fact that I was being asked to do a task at all, and that I could not leave, that I felt I was not allowed to leave. And so I felt trapped. This in particular, in regards to employment, is how I felt all the time. And every day I would have that countdown along with the clock where I'd say, okay, I have 8 hours left in this shift, and then half an hour left. I'd be like, okay, I have 7.5 hours left. I just need to get through that a few more times. And halfway through, I'd be like, okay, we're halfway through. I just need to do that one more time, and then I can go home. And I would get stuck in this sort of thought loop of, I just have to get through this, and then I can go home, but then I have to do it again tomorrow, but then I just have to get through it, and then I can go home, but then I have to do it again tomorrow. And it was, a thought loop consisting of 3 steps, and 2 of the steps were awful, of like, get through this and then do it again. And that is anxiety. That's anxiety. And it could very easily spiral down into panic at any given time, depending on my stress levels. I felt trapped. I felt there was no future. I felt this was hell, that I was stuck in hell. And sure, I'm absolutely sure that many, many people feel some sense of this when they're employed. But for me, it was so pervasive, so persistent, so constant, and in fact pathological. Not something that I can just, coping method my way out of, or breathing exercise my way out of. And I did try those things. The longest job I was able to hold, I held for 2 years. And that's mostly because the tasks of the day were varied, right? Like there were certain tasks that I had to do, and I could do them in pretty much any order, except for when there was customer demands. Like if they ordered food, or if they came up to the register, then I would have to stop whatever I'm doing. And that was really irritating in its own way. But the other reason I was able to get through that 2 years of employment is because I was smoking a lot of weed, and I was smoking a lot of weed at the job. So I was basically just high constantly. And that's not really an enjoyable state to be in. Even at the time, I didn't really talk to people or admit it, because this was my one and only coping method that would get me through work and help me maintain my job. But I didn't want to be high all the time. I didn't really sincerely enjoy that. But it was what I had to do to get through the anxiety that I was facing. And I have also taken anxiety medications that aren't weed, and they don't really do anything for me. In fact, even weed isn't a perfect solution. The perfect solution would be giving me more autonomy, allowing me to feel like I have a choice in my own life. And it's almost, you could almost call it like perfectionist drive for autonomy in a way, because there is a perfectionism element to it, at least for me, right? It's not just like, for example, let's take an example of my parents asking me to do the dishes. They would come up and they would say, can you do the dishes now, please? Maybe they would say please. Sure, that's polite. But for me, it still felt like an attack on my autonomy. I have to do it right now? Can you give me 5 minutes? Can you tell me, right? Like if they'd ask, like, can you get to the dishes at some point today? It's okay if you don't. Then I would have done it right then and there, because I would have felt like I had a choice, and that my choice that I was making was being nice and being a good child by doing it right away. Instead, it was demanded of me to do it right now, right away. You don't have a choice. Your body and your labor belong to us, your parents. So do the dishes right now because we said so. And that's how the discussion would always go whenever I would say, can you give me 5 minutes? Can I do it later? Etc. Just, attempts to give myself back some sense of control. And it was interpreted as disrespect, and as being bratty, and being stubborn, and being lazy. But in this scenario, the anxiety not only comes from, the fact that I feel like I'm losing control over myself, but also if somebody has to ask me to do a task, the moment they ask me, it feels as if I've already failed by not doing it already. And so I want to do it even less because, well, I already failed. And that's where the perfectionism comes in. Even getting a compliment on previously well done work can trigger this PDA anxiety, because it feels like a demand to be perfect next time as well, to do it again and do it perfect again, to do it just as well as you did, if not better. And that's sort of the line of thinking and the line of reasoning that happens in my brain immediately upon receiving a compliment, especially face to face. It feels as if anytime there's an authority figure, this also may be where some of the autistic disrespect for authority comes from. But it feels, I don't like the concept of authority at all. It's not just that I don't want somebody having authority over me. I also don't want to have authority, because that is also an obligation. I don't want to have or be in this relationship that is imbalanced, because there's obligation in both directions. Instead, I would rather have relationships with people where we are equals, unique equals, and we are collaborating and working together and cooperating, rather than having obligations to each other because of our social role in comparison to each other or something like that. Right? It feels a lot like social interactions are transactional, which means that there's an obligation. Having friends even can be exhausting and anxiety inducing, because now my identity, my sense of self is tied up in how much these random people like me and enjoy my presence. And so if I don't do a good job at being a good friend, then who am I even? Who am I? I've lost myself. I've lost control of my life already again. So, as you can tell, this can be a very difficult thing to deal with, and it's pervasive, right? It can affect every aspect of one's life. On top of this, anytime there was a compromise, it wasn't really a compromise, and I could tell, but the other person can never tell, because they don't really know what's going on in my mind, right? They don't really know that my stress tolerance is lower. They don't know that my anxiety is on a hair trigger. They don't know that my nervous system is hyper-connected and extra sensitive. They don't know these things, and they can't really understand it unless I take the time to explain it to them. But because of this, anytime there was a compromise, they would be operating under the assumption that I was just like them, right? Let's say we're trying to split a task, right? That I have 50 energy units to do this task, and they have 100 energy units to do the task. And we're trying to split up this task, but as we're talking, they don't know that I only have 50 energy units. They think I have 100 units just like they do. And so when I say, can you do 50% more of this task for me? Or can you do, twice the work that I'm going to put in because you have twice the energy? They say, I don't have twice the energy. We have the same amount of energy. I'm not going to do twice the amount of work as you. That's not fair. So the compromise is that we split it 50-50. But on my end, that's not fair to me, because I don't have as much energy as they do. Right? So anytime there was a compromise, I would always get the sense that they were trying to take advantage of me, and that compromises aren't really compromises. And this is something that comes along with the transactional nature of social interaction and social obligation, when I'm interacting with people socially, there's an expectation that I'm going to give them back what they give to me. But oftentimes they give me more than I can give back, or I simply just don't have enough to give. Especially when I'm in burnout, and this is something that people really, really struggle to understand is burnout. They really think that it's just laziness. But when I'm, my resources for life, for my mind, for my body are depleted, it's not always super visible from the outside, and people don't get it. And so they make demands of me that I cannot follow through on. But because I am a bit of a perfectionist, a bit of a people pleaser, and I'm scared that if I don't, cooperate with people and do what they ask of me, then they're going to kick me to the curb and I'm going to be alone, I try to do things that I don't have the energy for. And this repeated history of, being forced to do things that I can't really do, that I don't really have the energy for, has caused this PDA thing to get even worse. Because now I have PTSD, legitimate PTSD related to employment. And so every time somebody in my comment section says you should just get a job or something to that effect, it sets off my anxiety. Because now I'm thinking, no, there's absolutely no way that I can do that. There's no way that I may be able-bodied, but my mind is completely broken in regards to that. It sends me spiraling into anxiety. And this is also a reason I don't like working with case managers, because every single session they will tell me to get a job, even after I tell them why I can't. So PDA, it is called pathological demand avoidance, and pathological does imply that it is sort of like an irrational fear. And a lot of the time, it is irrational, right? Like my parents asking me to do the dishes, that's just a normal thing. They could have asked me more nicely. They could have definitely been more nice about it, and that would have produced results. But just, the act of asking me to do the dishes, that's not an unreasonable thing. And so in those cases, I'd want to cope with it. I'd want to calm my anxiety and soothe myself and find a way to do the task without sacrificing my autonomy and my sense of self. And there are ways. But when it comes to something like having a job, I don't think that the fears I have in regards to that, the anxiety I have in regards to my autonomy with employment, I don't think those are irrational fears. I don't think those are irrational fears. I think those are very, very rational fears. I think the sense of imprisonment and entrapment that I felt every time I was employed is real. I think that is a real thing, and I think that my instinct to avoid employment is actually keeping me safe right now. And I think neurotypical people accept way too much bullshit during employment. Y'all sacrifice your autonomy and your sense of self way too much. This is something that I've noticed with neurotypical people, and it saddens me because, to be honest with you, it's not something that I'm capable of doing. But I've noticed that a lot of people, and this is why people end up having midlife crises or quarter life crises, is because they take on a life that has been prescribed to them by the people around them. They put on this mask, and neurotypical people have a mask as well. It's maybe a little thinner, or maybe a little more coherent than neurodivergent people. But neurotypical people definitely have a mask, and they put on this mask and they live this life that they were told to live, and then at some point they realize that their sense of self has been given to them by the world. And now they feel their autonomy is threatened, and this is when the midlife crisis happens. It's something very similar. And for me, it's pathological and pervasive and persistent, which means that I always have that sense of like, I need to maintain my sense of self. I need to know who I am at all times. And I need to be an individual that is capable of cooperating with other individuals. That is how I feel like I'm part of a group. By maintaining my individuality in relationship to the group. Like, who am I to these people? When I'm employed, I am a coworker. Sure, to the individuals around me, they can be friendly. Some of them definitely weren't. Most of my coworkers were not friendly to me because of my social difficulties. But to the corporation, I'm just a number, right? I'm not an individual. I'm just a replaceable unit. And that's what sucks up my identity and chews it up and spits it out on the ground in front of me and says, this is what you are. You are just fodder for the corporation. I could very, very intimately feel that when I was employed. And I'm not sure if neurotypical people feel it. I'm sure most of them understand cognitively what I'm trying to say here. But to actually feel it at every moment when you're clocked in at work, that's something very, very different. So the last thing I'm going to mention here in regards to PDA is the flow state. Wu Wei is a concept in Taoism. It's called effortless action, is vaguely what it translates to. And Wu Wei is this sense, it's basically the flow state. It's this sense of I'm just existing and this is what I'm doing right now. You almost become your actions. The sense of self, the identity almost falls away and becomes integrated with your current moment of existence, right? So when you think about what the sense of self is, it's almost like a collection of memories, autobiographical memories, and ideas and concepts about oneself. This is what I am, and this is what I can do. But Wu Wei shifts that perspective to, this is what I am doing right now. And you don't even think about yourself or anything, you just become yourself. Pretty much everybody has experienced this. If you play video games, you get into a flow state while playing video games, right? If you get immersed in a movie, this is a very, very, very simple, common example of this. It's getting immersed in a movie can be considered like a Wu Wei, right? Because your body sits there and your mind interprets and takes in what it's seeing in front of it smoothly, without interruption, without too much thinking about where do I fit in here, what, etc., right? It's just happening. You are just happening. That's what Wu Wei is. When you are just happening and you are coalesced with the task at hand, whatever that may be. Sometimes it doesn't have to be a task. Sometimes it's meditation or something, which I guess is kind of a task. But anyway, this idea is very, very appealing, and I think it's very appealing to autistic people in particular because of our monotropic brains, our sort of, laser focus on whatever we're doing. It's a very natural state for us to be in. That's actually just how our brains would like to operate at all times. And so for me, it's always been really easy to drop into that state. And I always just want to stay there. This is also why we struggle with transitions, right? Moving from one task to another. Now, I suspect I also have ADHD, which means that I do get very laser focused on a task and I get into that flow state, but then sometimes every 30 to 40 minutes to an hour maybe, my brain will sort of interrupt me and be like, hey, we need a break. and I'll sort of look around, I'll look up, I'll step away from the task for a moment, I'll take a sip of water or something. And I think this is very good for me, because otherwise I would literally be focused on the same thing for hours and hours and hours and hours, and I wouldn't eat or drink or use the bathroom or anything. But I'm getting into some different topics here. What I wanted to talk about in this video is pathological demand avoidance. And yeah, this is really something that I've only learned about recently. And I mean, I think even like the mental health field, even like therapists and psychiatrists don't really nobody ever mentioned this or brought this up to me as a possibility. It was always like general anxiety, right? And I was asked one time in therapy if I worry a lot. And I was like, well, I mean, I don't worry about the state of the world or anything like that. I mean, as much as anybody else does, I guess. But I worry about my future. I worry about things regarding myself a whole lot. I worry about, my sense of self and who am I and what am I really capable of? What can I do? What do I want to do, etc. That's what I worry about. And I worry about disappointing people. That's also what I worry about. And that is pathological demand avoidance. That's PDA anxiety. And I was told that I don't actually have anxiety during that session, which is strange because every other mental health professional I've been to has been like, yeah, that's anxiety. That's regular old bog standard anxiety, but it's really not. It's truly exhausting. It's truly exhausting. We live in a world that demands too much of even healthy, average people. And so for us neurodivergent people that have less energy resources and less mental resources, it can really be frustrating trying to, get accommodated, especially with people saying that this is just laziness or whatever. The proof that it's not laziness should be that it can apply to oneself as well, right? That the anxiety, the demand avoidance can apply to things that would completely 100% benefit you, that you want to do, but it just feels like it's gonna be too overwhelming. It feels like it's gonna be like you're just not gonna do it good enough. You're just not ready for it yet, right? What it feels like is, it feels like I'm living life with a gun to my head, like I'm being forced to live my life. And just that sensation in and of itself is so imprisoning. What do you do with that? Right? What do you do? I have to learn to love life, but I have to also balance my own limited resources with the demands of living life and the demands that other people make of me to prove to them that I'm worthy of living a life. Nobody's holding a gun to my head and forcing me to live. But at the same time, I'm not gonna just not live. That's not really an option. So I am sort of stuck with this very perpetual, very pervasive, very persistent anxiety. I almost feel like I've been living in a constant state of fight or flight, and I didn't even realize it until recently. But when I think about it, when I really, really think about it, yes, my anxiety is really bad. It's really, really bad. And it's because I don't feel like I have control over my own life. All of the things that I could do to have control, to gain control, would be sacrificing control in some other way, right? I don't have money, so I could get a job, but getting a job literally gives me PTSD flashbacks thinking about it. So that's not gonna happen. which is why I'm begging for money on the internet instead. Because as much as I don't really want to do that either, at the very least, it is a self-driven activity. It's a self-directed way of getting some money. And I really appreciate all of the people that have supported me and that understand that that I'm not just being lazy, right? That actually my life is incredibly difficult and taxing, and it's actually fucking incredible that I've gotten this far without going completely insane. So yeah, a little bit of a shorter video today, but I hope this opens some eyes. I hope this gives people some insight. If you can relate to this, let us know in the comments. This is a very little known, very little talked about aspect of neurodivergence and autism. And I think more people need to be, open to the idea that they might have something called pathological demand avoidance. This is why we're trying to change the name, because it's not a very flattering name. It really sounds like some psychologist who was studying some autistic kids and got really frustrated with them and was like, pathological demand avoidance, they're avoiding my demands pathologically. It's not flattering. But this is why we're trying to rename it to persistent drive for autonomy. I think even perfectionist drive for autonomy could apply in some cases. So yeah, if you relate to this, you're not alone. Let us know. If you learned anything from this, if this was a valuable video to you in any way, please consider giving it a like. Please consider subbing to the channel. I am homeless. I live in my car, and I'm fundraising for a van to improve my living situation so that I can make better videos in the future and earn money in a way that doesn't give me constant anxiety. I'll leave a link to that fundraiser in the description, as well as a couple other places. I'll leave my Patreon, and thank you to my Patreon supporters. I'll leave my Ko-fi and Cash App as well if you'd like to make a one-time donation to support my life. And have a great day, everyone. Have an autonomous day. Have a self-directed day. Thank you for watching, and have a peaceful day.